The library at Ashmore Park smelled of beeswax and old paper, and the particular kind of quiet that falls only on houses where someone is very recently dead. Margaret Norris stood in the passage outside the library door with a basin of warm water. She no longer needed, and the words she had just heard still ringing behind her eyes, like a bell that would not stop. The voices on the other side of the door had been low and deliberate. The voice of a man accustomed to speaking without witnesses, and the voice of another man agreeing with the confident murmur of someone who had agreed before. She had not meant to stop. She had been returning from the Earl's chamber where the old man had been still and cold since before the morning bell, and the passage was dim, and her feet had paused of their own accord when she heard the name Cresswell pronounced in a tone one did not use for a man who had just died. She had stood long enough to hear everything. The basin was heavy. She moved away from the door with the measured step she had learned in 12 years of nursing. The step that says, "I am only a servant. I saw nothing. I carry only what I am paid to carry." And she walked back to the room where Lord Cresswell's body lay in the gray morning light, and she set the basin down on the washstand with a care that made no sound. And she stood for a long moment with her hands clasped and her heart very loud in the silence of that room. The Earl had been her patient for 7 months. He had been querulous and sometimes unkind, as sick old men can be, and he had called her nurse rather than her name for all of that time. But in the last weeks, when the laudanum had thinned and sleep had come less often, he had told her things. Not confessions. He was not the confessing sort. Details. The house would go to his son, the name Cresswell would continue, the title and the land and the paintings in the gallery would pass intact as he had always intended. He had said this not to her, but near her the way old men do when they are thinking aloud in the presence of someone they have decided does not count as an audience. He had told her the name of the solicitor, the name of the village, the date on which a second copy had been lodged privately, 18 months prior, precisely because he had not trusted the first copy alone. She had counted. She had remembered. The voices behind the library door had been Mr. Aldous Pell, the estate steward, and someone she had not recognized speaking of another will entirely, one that had not existed yesterday. If she was correct, by tomorrow morning it would appear to have existed for years. She looked at the late Earl in the pale light from the window. He had been a difficult man, and she had cared for him anyway, because that was what she did, and in the last weeks of it, he had trusted her with the sound of his thinking, because he had decided she was furniture. She was not furniture. She did not know what a woman in her position was expected to do. With such a thing, she was not family. She was not even a domestic of long standing at Ashmore Park. She had come from a registry in Bath, engaged for the specific duration of the Earl's illness, and her engagement would terminate with the reading of the will. There was not one person in this house to whom she could bring this and be certain of being heard. She knew the housekeeper slightly, a cautious woman named Mrs. Maya Farrow, who had been at Ashmore Park since before the current steward, and who would weigh the word of a temporary nurse against the word of a 19-year man very carefully, and arrive perhaps at caution. She did not know the solicitor, who was not expected until noon. She did not know the late Earl's eldest son, now the new Earl who had his own grief and his own concerns and who she had seen only twice in 7 months, once entering, once leaving, both times moving with the preoccupied step of a man managing a great many things at once. She knew the Viscount Hartmore by reputation alone. His reputation was not warm. He was the new Earl's younger brother, the second son. The man the servants called precise, and the family's solicitor. She had once overheard through an open door, called quietly, relentless. He had arrived the previous evening, the last of the family to come, delayed by weather on the road from Wiltshire. She had seen him in the corridor before dinner, a tall man in a dark coat, perhaps 32 or 33, moving without haste, saying very little, with a quality of attention about him that she had noticed from the distance of a doorway and then put deliberately from her mind. The way she put many things from her mind, as a matter of professional practice. She put her hands flat on the counterpane beside the Earl's still form, and told herself the sensible thing to do was to say nothing. The sensible thing to do was to wait for the solicitor, submit her account, receive her references, and return to Bath. She did not do the sensible thing. She found the Viscount in the east drawing-room at 7:30, standing at the window with a cup of tea he had not yet touched, looking out at the park where the frost had not lifted from the grass. He turned when she came in, and his face received her presence without changing. A trained aristocratic stillness that she recognized as the face people wore when they had already been managing too many things before breakfast, and his eyes moved once, quickly, taking in her gray dress, her plain cap, the careful set of her hands. "You are the nurse," he said. It was not a question, and it was not unkind. "Miss Norris," she said, "I am sorry to intrude on your grief, my lord. I would not do so if I believed it could wait." She told him what she had heard. She told him the precise words because she had trained herself over 12 years to hold the spoken word as carefully as a physical thing. A temperature, a pulse count, a dosage, and she could reproduce it almost verbatim. She told him the time. She told him how long she had stood. She told him the tone of Pell's voice when he said the word legitimate, and the sound of the second man's assent, which had been quick and practiced, the assent of someone confirming a previously agreed arrangement. She told him the Earl's own words about the disposition of the house, repeated back now from memory, the words of a man who had not been confessing to her but had permitted her to listen. She told him about the second copy, the private solicitor in the village, the date the Earl had mentioned. She watched the Viscount's face while she said this, and saw nothing change in it, and then saw something change beneath, what changed a compression around the eyes that was not grief, and was not surprise. He had been waiting, she understood, for something he could work with. "You heard all of this," he said. "Yes, my lord, from the passage." "Yes." The door was not fully closed. "I would estimate it was open 4 or 5 inches, enough to hear clearly, not enough to be seen from inside without crossing the room." Something shifted in the way he was standing. Not a flinch, not an adjustment, visible in the body's surface. A decision made below the level of the visible. He looked at her, and she was accustomed to being looked at, the way one looks at useful furniture, and this was not that. This was the look of someone calibrating a source of information he had not expected and had decided to trust. "You knew what it might cost you if this goes forward and you are named as a witness," he said. She had thought about this on the walk down from the Earl's chamber. She had thought about her reference, which Pell or his ally could make very inconvenient if they chose. She had thought about the registry in Bath, where a disputed account from a house where she had only been 7 months would not assist her. She had thought about the fact that Pell had been with the house for 19 years, and she had been here since June. "I understand," she said. "I am telling you nonetheless." He held her gaze for a moment. The frost outside was very still, and the room was very cold, and she did not look away. "Stay in the house," he said. "Do not speak to Pell. Do not speak to anyone else about what you heard. Go back to the Earl's chamber, and remain there until I come to you. I will come before noon." It was a command. She recognized the register, short, level, organized around her protection rather than his convenience, dressed in the syntax of an order. She did not know yet that this was how he expressed care. She was beginning to suspect it. She nodded once and went back upstairs. She remained in the Earl's chamber and made the small, formal preparations that fell to a nurse at the close of an engagement. The proper laying out had been done already by Mrs. Broad, Pharaoh's arrangement. But there were notes to complete, a final account to close, the small inventory of medicines to document for the solicitor's records. She worked with her hands while her mind was very quiet and very occupied, and she did not allow herself to consider what the Viscount would or would not do, because she had done what could be done, and the rest was not hers to carry. This was a thing she had learned in 12 years of sitting beside the beds of people who were dying. You do the thing you can do. You do not wait to know if it was sufficient. At 9:30 she heard the commotion below, footsteps moving with purpose along the lower passage, A door opened and closed with a weight that suggested decision, the particular quality of silence that follows a gathering of men who are not speaking in front of the household. She did not go to the window. She sat in the chair by the Earl's bed, where she had sat for 212 nights, and she waited, and the frost outside the window continued very gradually to lift. The Viscount had not wasted the 2 hours. She would learn this afterward, in pieces from the housekeeper, and from the under-footman who could not contain himself at supper, and from one brief factual account that the Viscount provided himself, at the end of the day, with the economy of a man reporting a completed action. He had gone from the east drawing-room directly to the library. He had spent 40 minutes there that Pell would not afterward account for, in the course of which he had opened certain drawers, reviewed certain ledgers, and established, through the specific kind of quiet, thorough examination that was apparently his natural mode, the precise shape of what Pell had been arranging. He had then sent the footman he had traveled with, not the house's footman, his own, to the village 2 miles distant, carrying a note for the second solicitor whose name and village the Earl had spoken aloud on one of those late thin laudanum evenings to a nurse he had decided was furniture. The second solicitor arrived at Ashmore Park before 10 o'clock. He arrived carrying a document the Earl had filed with him privately 18 months prior, a document that matched, with complete fidelity, every detail the Earl had spoken into the silence of a sick room over the course of 7 months of illness. Pell was a practical man. Practical men, when confronted with a copy they did not know existed, presented to them by a Viscount who had also had 40 minutes alone with their ledgers, tend to fold. He folded before 11. What happened next was procedural and without spectacle, which suited the Viscount's style. The housekeeper said later, in a tone of admiration she did not think to disguise, Pell was not taken before a magistrate that morning. He was presented in the library, with the document and the specific arithmetic of proceeding further, and he withdrew. The man she had not recognized, a scrivener from Taunton, the underfootman, said, in a tone of scandal that suggested Taunton was exactly the kind of place one would find such a person, had been identified through the ledger entry, that the Viscount had spent 40 minutes locating, and by noon had declined through a message sent by Pell's own hand, to be party to anything further. There was no raised voice in the gallery. There was no confrontation in the dining room. The library was simply, definitively closed to Aldous Pell for the remainder of the day, and the under-footman reported, with the solemn relish of a young man who has been present at something historic, that Mr. Cacott Pell had taken his midday meal alone in the steward's room, and had not come out since the family solicitor arrived at noon to read the will that had always existed. It said precisely what the Earl had said near his nurse on those thin laudanum evenings, in the half-dark of a room where he had not thought to consider who was listening, and the house and the title and the paintings in the gallery were distributed exactly as he had intended. And nothing in the document had been altered from the version he had signed in the year 1823. Margaret Norris sat at the edge of the assembled household during the reading, in the long drawing-room with the curtains drawn to half-mourning, between the housekeeper and a housemaid whose name she had not yet learned. She was aware, through the particular peripheral attention of a woman accustomed to reading a room without appearing to read it, that the Viscount was standing 3 persons to her left, and that he had not looked at her since she came in. She told herself that this was entirely appropriate and exactly what she had expected. Midway through the solicitor's reading, she became aware that this was the last time she would be in this room. Her engagement terminated today. Her trunk was already packed. She had a coach to meet at 2 o'clock in the village, if the solicitor ran to time, and from the village she would go back to Bath, and from Bath she would wait for the registry to find her a new patient in a new house. And the particular frostlight of this particular morning would become one of the undistinguished mornings she had lived through in 12 years of this work, many of them undistinguished, and which she generally did not dwell on. She kept her hands folded in her lap, listened to the solicitor, and did not dwell. He found her in the passage afterward, collecting her pelisse from the chair where she had laid it before the reading. She was drawing on her gloves, plain brown leather, the left one, with a small repair at the seam that she had made herself when she heard him in the passage behind her, and turned. "Miss Norris," he said. He was still in the dark coat, still with that quality of stillness about him, and the afternoon had done something to the light through the passage windows that made his face less formal than it had seemed at 7:30. Or perhaps it was that she was looking at him differently now, with the account settled and the coal morning urgency gone, and there was more to see when you were not trying to convey information quickly. "I wished to tell you," he said, "that the solicitor has recorded your account as a material statement in the estate proceedings. It names you, it records the substance of what you heard, and it has been witnessed by the second solicitor and countersigned. You will not be called before a magistrate unless Pell changes his position, which he shows no sign of doing. Your name is in the record. It will remain there." She understood this to mean that she was protected, that what she had brought downstairs at 7:30 was not going to be quietly argued away by a steward's long tenure and a registry's cautious calculation. "Thank you," she said. He was quiet a moment. The passage clock ticked, slow and unhurried, the way clocks tick in houses where everything of importance has already happened today. "You knew what it might cost," he said. "Yes, and you came downstairs nonetheless." "What?" "He was my patient," she said. "He told me what he wanted for his house. It seemed the least that could be done." The Viscount looked at her for a moment. Not the swift inventory of 7:30 which had been assessment. Something that stayed longer and was occupied with a different kind of attention. "Your reference," he said, "will not come through the house's regular channels. Pell will not be in a position to interfere with a reference from this house after today, but I would prefer not to depend on that. I will provide the reference myself." She understood what this meant. A reference from the Viscount, the second son of an earl, brother of the new Lord Cresswell, carried a different weight than a standard domestic letter. In the registry in Bath, in the houses where she would next be sent, the name would not be questioned. "That is very generous," she said. "It is the appropriate thing," he said. Something in the precision of it, the deflection of generosity toward appropriateness, made her think that he was a man who found it difficult to be thanked and had developed a system for redirecting gratitude. She put on her second glove and smoothed it at the wrist. "I have a coach at 2, she said. "Yes," he said. He did not move. She had the distinct impression of a man who intended to do something and had not yet located the language for it. "Safe travels, Miss Norris," he said. She nodded once in the manner she had used all morning and walked down the passage toward the front of the house, and she told herself on the way down that this was the end of it, which was the correct and sensible thing to tell herself. She believed it for approximately 11 days. If you have stayed with this story to its middle, stay a little longer. The end is where the Viscount makes his accounting, and the accountings of precise men are worth waiting for. She was back in Bath, resettled in her lodgings on a quiet street near the pump room, waiting for the registry to find her a new patient in January, when the letter arrived on the 18th of November. The handwriting on the outside was not a hand she recognized, and she stood with it unopened for a moment, aware that her heart had done something that was not an entirely medical response. She opened it. It was written in a hand that wasted nothing. Short lines, exact words, no ornament. The kind of prose a man produces when he has drafted and revised and cut the unnecessary until what remains is only what must remain. The first paragraph established that Pell had submitted a revised account to the local magistrate in the second week of November, an account that named a second party and revised certain details of his own role. It established that this revision had included a more specific reference to the nurse who had been in the passage on the morning of the 12th, and that this reference had been addressed before it required any action from her. Because the Viscount had been in correspondence with both solicitors continuously in the intervening weeks, and had prepared for exactly this revision before it arrived, her name was still in the record. It still required nothing further. The second paragraph was shorter than the first, and a different kind of short. It asked, with the precision of a man who was not accustomed to asking, whether Miss Norris would be willing to receive a visitor. should one happen to be passing through Bath on his way to Bristol on a matter of business. She read this paragraph twice. She read it a third time, which she rarely did with anything, holding it up to the window light as though more illumination would help her understand it better. She wrote back the following morning by the early post, a note of 3 sentences. The first said that she would be at home on Thursday afternoon. The second said that Bath in November was cold, and the tea at her lodgings was reliable. The third said that she hoped the business in Bristol was not pressing, because pressing business made for poor conversation. She was not certain, after she sent it, whether the third sentence had been appropriate. She spent 2 days being uncertain of this, and on Thursday at 3 o'clock the Viscount Hartmore arrived at her lodgings on the quiet street, with the travel mud still on his boots, and a look in his face that told her he had not stopped for long. She let him in. She poured the tea. He sat in the small chair across from her fire, a good fire. She had made sure of it, and he took the cup she offered and held it without drinking, looking at the fire in the manner of a man who has been thinking about something for long enough that he has decided to stop thinking and start saying. "Pell's revised account mentioned your name more specifically than I had anticipated," he said. "I should have written immediately when I first became aware of it. I did not, because I was managing the solicitor's responses before the revision could reach you, and by the time those arrangements were secure, I found that I had written a great many letters about the matter to a great many people and was reluctant to write the one to you." "Why reluctant?" she said. He looked at her across the small table with the tea things between them. "Because the letter to you," he said, "was not about Pell." The fire said what fires say in the silence of small rooms in November. She set her own cup down. She was a woman who had sat in many rooms in many silences, and had learned to wait inside them, and she waited now because she was fairly certain she understood what he was going to say, and she wanted to let him say it precisely, in his own precise way, because it would be different from anything she had heard said to her before. "I have been thinking," he said, "about a woman who stood in a passage outside a library door with a basin of warm water, and a piece of information that could have cost her considerably, and chose to come downstairs with it. I have been thinking about the particular quality of that choice, what it required of her, what she understood it might take, and what she chose anyway." He paused. He was not a man who paused for effect. He paused when he was finding exactness. "I find I am not able to stop thinking about it. This is unusual for me." She looked at her hands in her lap. She had learned, over 12 years, to keep her hands from telling things her face was not ready to say. She was not entirely certain she was managing it now. "You might consider," she said, "that it was simply the correct thing to do. That most people in the same position would have done the same." "I have considered it," he said, "and I do not believe it is true. I think most people in the same position would have done the sensible thing, which was to say nothing. The correct thing and the sensible thing are not always the same." He set his own cup down. "You chose the correct thing when the sensible thing was available." "I have been thinking about that every day for 3 weeks." She looked up. He was watching her with the steadiness she had first seen through a doorway. At 7:30, in the gray morning, and this time she did not look away. This time she let herself read what was there, which she had been not permitting herself to do since before the coach from Ashmore Park, because reading it did not help her when she was leaving. "I should tell you," she said carefully, "that I have an engagement beginning in January near Bristol." "I know," he said. She waited. "I am traveling to Bristol," he said, "on a matter of business. You said so in your letter." "I should have been more precise," he said. "The business in Bristol required my attention in October. I arranged to address it in December, so that passing through Bath was a reasonable thing for a man traveling from Wiltshire to Bristol to do." She looked at him for a long moment. The fire crackled. The clock on the mantelpiece measured the room's quiet. Outside the window, Bath in November was cold and gray and entirely itself. "Lord Hartmore," she said. "Miss Norris," he said. The way he said it was different from 7:30. It was different from the passage. It was different from every context in which her name had been spoken since June, and she felt the difference of it in the part of her that she had spent 12 years training not to feel things in, with only partial success. "You came from Wiltshire to Bath," she said. "Specifically." "Yes." "In November." "In November," he confirmed with something in his voice that was not quite humor, but was the direction humor would travel in a man like this. The direction it would take if permitted to arrive. She thought about the letter folded in the book on the side table. She thought about the third sentence of her reply, which she had written without being entirely certain she should. She thought about 12 years of sitting in the chair that did not count as an audience, being present to the private thoughts of people who had decided she was furniture, and how much she had heard and how much she had remembered, and how almost none of it had been hers. She thought about a man who had set a teacup on a window ledge on a frost-covered morning, and made a decision visible only in the stillness beneath the surface of him. "The tea is going cold," she said. "I know." He did not move to take the cup. She reached across and poured his tea out and filled it again from the pot, because she was a practical woman, and because she needed something to do with her hands that was not what her hands wanted to do. He watched her pour. The firelight was on his face, and the room was small and the street outside was quiet, and she set the pot down and her hand was steadier than she had expected it to be, and she looked at it for a moment as though confirming this. "I would like," she said to the teacup, "to understand what it is that you intend." "I intend," he said, "to call on you regularly, with the appropriate formality, for as long as you will permit it. I intend to be patient about it, because I imagine patience is what the situation requires, and I am generally capable of patience when the object of it warrants the effort." He paused again. "I intend," he said more quietly, "to be honest with you about this because I believe you prefer honesty to the alternative, and because I have no practice at the alternative." She looked at him fully. She let herself look, without the professional management she had applied to every room for 12 years. He was 33, she thought, perhaps 34. He had the face of a man who had spent a considerable amount of time being responsible for things that other people would have preferred to ignore, and who had found a kind of satisfaction in this that did not require anyone else's acknowledgement. He had not come to Bath because it was convenient, he had come because it was not, and he had done it anyway, which she recognized as the same grammar as going downstairs at 7:30. "I am a nurse," she said, "of no family. No fortune. An engagement near Bristol in January." "Yes," he said. "I know all of this. You are a Viscount." "I am the second son of an Earl," he said, which is somewhat less than it sounds, and considerably less than certain people in this story have been inclined to make of it. Was, and vid me. She felt something move in her chest, something that had kept itself orderly for 5 weeks, and had apparently decided it was done being orderly. "I will not be an easy person to call upon," she said. "I keep odd hours. My lodgings are not fashionable. I have opinions about medical practice that are considered inappropriate for a woman to hold, and I express them to anyone who asks, and several people who do not." "Good," he said. "I have found the fashionable opinions to be considerably less useful than advertised." She held his gaze for a long moment. He held hers. The clock measured 12 more seconds of it. "Thursday next," she said. "I visit a patient in the afternoon. I am free in the morning." Something moved in his face. Not a smile, not quite, but the direction a smile would travel if it were making the journey from a long distance, the way snow falls when there is no wind. "Thursday morning," he said. She picked up her cup. He picked up his, quote, "I be." They drank their tea in the particular silence of two people who are not saying everything they mean, and are both entirely aware of this, and are both for the first time in their individual experience of such silences, content to let the silence hold a little longer. The calls extended. November became December, and the mornings in Bath grew shorter, and the calls did not. He was punctual to the hour and sometimes stayed past it, which she had begun to anticipate by the second week, and she moved the tea things to the larger table by the fire without remarking on it, and he did not remark on it either. And this seemed to be its own kind of conversation. He told her about Wiltshire, about the house there that had come to him through a family settlement rather than inheritance, smaller than Ashmore Park, with a garden that had been badly managed in the previous tenancy and was recovering slowly, and a library with good north light that he used for correspondence in the mornings. She told him about Bath, about the registry, about the particular arithmetic of a working woman's independence, what it cost, and what it provided, and what it did not provide, which she said with the directness she had warned him about and he received without flinching, which she noted. She told him about a patient she had nursed in her 3rd year of practice, a naval captain whose wife had not believed he would survive the winter, and who had asked Margaret quietly, before Christmas, whether it was appropriate to begin making other arrangements. She had told the wife that it was premature. The captain had lived another 6 years. She told this story without particular emphasis, as an example of the work, and the Viscount listened with the particular quality of attention she had first noted in a doorway and had thought a great deal about since. "You told her the truth?" he said. "I told her what I knew," she said. She did not want to hear it, yet she needed to. He was quiet for a moment. "My father," he said, "had a steward for 11 years before Pell, a man named Hadfield." My father did not want to hear in the last 2 years of Hadfield's tenure that certain accounts were irregular. 2 people told him. He declined to act on it until Hadfield left of his own accord, and the accounts were examined afterward. He paused. "I have thought about those 2 people a great deal. I do not think either of them knew the other had tried. She understood what he was telling her. Not confessing. He was not the confessing sort. Details, the way his father had spoken near her. Details about a man who understood the cost of telling the truth and the particular loneliness of doing it without knowing whether anyone else was doing it too. They did the correct thing, she said. Yes, he said. They did. In the 3rd week of March, in that same room with that same fire, the Viscount asked her a question in 9 words, and she answered in 2. And he crossed the room in the careful manner of a man who is aware that he is doing something that cannot be undone and has decided that this is the point, and she stood to meet him, because she had known since November that she was going to. The engagement was announced to his brother first, and then to the Countess, who required 3 days and 2 long conversations with the Earl, before she arrived at a position she could occupy with grace. She arrived at it. She was a woman who had been confidently wrong before, about different things, and she had learned over many years of being wrong in front of audiences to make the adjustment with dignity, if not with speed. "She is not what I would have chosen," the Countess said to her son on the 2nd day. "No," said the Viscount, "she is what I would have chosen." The Countess looked at her second son for a long moment. He had always been the difficult one, by which she meant the one who said exactly what he meant. She had found this quality inconvenient for 33 years. She found it slightly less inconvenient now. The wedding was in June, at a church near Wiltshire, with a small party. Afterward, at the house with the neglected garden. The solicitor who had arrived at Ashmore Park before 10 o'clock in November came, because the Viscount had thought to invite him, and the Viscount thought of everything. The housekeeper sent a letter that began correctly and became, by the 2nd paragraph, unexpectedly warm. The under-footman, who had not been invited, wrote his own letter to Miss Norris, now Lady Hartmore, informing her that the garden at Ashmore Park had recovered somewhat from the west storm in February, and that Mr. Pell had been replaced by a young man from the village, and that the library had new curtains. She wrote back to the under-footman and thanked him for the report, and the Viscount, reading over her shoulder, said that it was kind of him to have written. He could not help it, she said. He is the sort of person who tells people things. The Viscount put his hand on her shoulder briefly, in the manner he had developed of touching her. Certain and quiet and unannounced, the way a fire gives warmth without declaring itself. The house in Wiltshire was not large and not fashionable, and the garden was recovering, and the library had good light in the mornings, and she had a study of her own now where she kept her medical texts and her notes from 12 years of practice, and the correspondence she maintained with 2 other nurses she had worked alongside in Bristol. Women who were trying to make the registry system more reliable for women who depended on it. She had opinions about this. She expressed them. The Viscount read her drafts and made precise marginal notes that were almost always correct, which she told him one evening when he handed back a letter she had been revising. And he said that this was because he had been thinking about the same problems from a different angle for a long time and had been waiting for someone to write the letters. The Earl's children came to Wiltshire in August, the three of them, and the youngest, who was now 4, brought his wooden horse and left it in the hall by mistake when they went back to Ashmore Park, and it sat in the hall for a week until a footman was sent to return it. The eldest girl asked Margaret about fevers before she left. A serious and careful inquiry that took 40 minutes and resulted in a list of written instructions that she folded and put in her pocket with the manner of someone who would read it again. The Viscount, watching from the doorway, said nothing. She had learned what his silences were for. In October, when the garden had gone to its autumn quiet, she stood at the library window in the early morning with the correspondence from the registry in Bath. There were 2 women she was trying to place. A nurse named Fellows, and a younger woman, newly trained, whose circumstances were limited and whose abilities, from what Margaret had seen of her work, were not. The letters required care. She was thinking about what care required when she heard the Viscount come into the library behind her, and she heard him without looking up because she had learned to hear him. He stood beside her at the window. Outside, the garden was settling into its brown autumn quiet, and there was frost on the furthest corner of the wall where the light did not reach until mid-morning, and the sky was the specific gray of an English October that promises nothing but delivers often more than it promises. He put his hand over hers the way he did, certain, unannounced, as though it were simply where his hand had always been intending to go. She set the letters down. The garden in October. The frost on the far wall. How? The library with its good north light. She turned her hand and held his. And the house that had wanted work was warm around them, and the morning was early, and there was time. If Margaret's story moved you, leave a word in the comments. She would not ask for anything more than that.